Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you guys to another episode of Panther Politico. I'm your host today, Phillip Lwiza, a second-year PhD student in international relations at Florida International University. And today we continue our conversation with experts across the political science and international relations to unpack major global issues through deep interdisciplinary analysis. For this episode, we're focusing on political transformation and democratic culture in East Africa and lessons from Tanzania. I'm honored today to be joined by two incredible guests. First, Dr. Cliff Uba Codero, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Morgan State University, whose work centers on African political economy, identity, and regionalism. Dr. Codero's expertise is especially relevant for understanding the political dynamics of Tanzania's current political crisis, regional authoritarian trends, and how ruling elites use regional blocs and identity politics to consolidate power. Dr. Codero is also an alumnus of FIU, a proud holder of a PhD from our program, so a great mentor as well. I happened to have the pleasure of meeting Professor Codero during a talk he paneled on Kenya's political shifts here and at FIU. So I was more than excited to have him accept an invitation to speak with myself and Professor Akhtar. And moving on to Professor Iqbal Akhtar, who holds a dual appointment at FIU's Department of Politics and International Relations and the Department of Religious Studies. His scholarship focused heavily on the deep cultural and political history of East Africa, especially Zanzibar and the Koja community. Dr. Akhtar's specialization in Islamic political thought and the history of Zanzibar helps illuminate the deeper historical roots of Tanzanian political culture. So I want to thank you very much, both of you, for being here. I know you're both very, very busy, so I appreciate this during rather turbulent and difficult times. And I know I know, just in case any of my relatives watch, I must honor our eldership. So I will say shikamoni to both of you, shikamo, shikamo. Habari.
Marhaba. Yeah.
Yes.
Marahaba.
Asante, asante. So, gentlemen, Tanzania is facing one of its most serious political crises since independence, with rising tensions around elections, increased centralization of power, and a new generation pushing back against old political norms. So today, I'd really appreciate if we could explore some of the roots of these legacies and how the youth movements, which are being mirrored as well in Kenya and Uganda across East Africa, are reshaping the region, and what Tanzania's current turmoil tells us about the future of democracy in East Africa. So I wanted to start with Professor Akhtar to kind of give us a little bit of a historical arc. So Tanzania's political culture didn't begin with independence. The Swahili Coast, Islamic scholarship, and merchant networks shaped political norms long before colonialism. So Professor Akhtar, how have these pre-colonial dynamics continue to influence political culture today, especially ideas of authority, unity, and community?
Thank you, Philip, for having me. I really appreciate it. I mean, I think part of one of the major challenges, I think, across not just Africa, but also Asia is the way, two things. I think one is the type of identities that came to be kind of, in a way, I would say institutionalized or kind of developed during the colonial period, which kind of separated out groups. I think the most, one of the clearest ways that you see that would be a place like Rwanda. The development of Hutu and Tutsi sort of identities in sort of the modern period. So I think that's one thing is kind of how people's ethnic and cultural identities were shaped in the colonial period. And the second was also the way that um, different groups were played off each other in terms of divide and rule as well. So you have minority groups that were given sort of power or status in society. And so really what ends up happening is that one, certain groups don't want to give up power, and we see that sort of in the Kenyan situation. Or, as in the case of Tanzania, really the type of institutions that need to that you need essentially for a functioning and healthy democracy are not really developed. So you need civil institutions, you need respect for rule of law, you need to have the idea of a loyal opposition. So the idea that you can oppose the government and still be seen as sort of a loyal member of the nation state, differing ideas of what it means to be part of the nation, all of these things that sort of help to that are that are part of what I would say is kind of a liberal democracy. A lot of them were also not developed in the colonial period, and so you see kind of the impoverishment of that influences kind of the elections, the election chaos that we're seeing in Tanzania, unfortunately today. So I think it's not just one thing; it's a combination of things. And Tanzania was blessed to have Mwalimu Nyerere, as the first president. In terms of being able to help develop a national identity, but at the same time, um, the cost of creating kind of a larger national identity was a loss of that sort of multi-vocality within society as well, having multiple political groups and sort of organizations competing and contesting the ideas of the nation. And so perhaps it was necessary at that time, but now as generations are moving and new political and economic realities are emerging, there needs to be create more space for younger generations and different perspectives.
This is a good point. Good point. This was where exactly good art, Professor. Thank you for that. Bringing in exactly where I would love to bring Professor Codero. This legacy of, as we know, in Mwalimu Nyerere, it's where a lot of us are looking back, trying to figure where maybe were these roots of the kind of difficulties and challenges there, being that he had a very noble, idea, and it has, created a rather almost an island of peace for so long, but there's some challenges that we're now seeing because of a lot of the influences of the kind of unilateral kind of shaping of Tanzania's kind of political culture. So, Professor Gadara, I'd love for you to kind of jump in there, kind of bring in your perspective and the roots of how you see it as well.
Thank you so much, Philip, and thank you, Dr. Akhtar. I think it's a wonderful illustration of a much more bolsterous history of Tanzania and why it's an island of peace, as Philip said earlier, but also sort of like the origin story of some of the things that we see today with regards to nation building and nation creation. So, as with regards to Mwalimu Nyerere, he's a wonderful scholar. Um, One of the more esteemed founding leaders after leaders of decolonization and founding leaders of independent states after decolonization. So he's way up there, way above his peers. He wasn't um, he wasn't shy of projecting his vision and crafting sort of a different articulation of what development meant at the time when most of the decolonizing African states were either choosing to follow scripts written mostly by European powers as to how the countries will be governed. Nyerere said he wanted a fundamentally African-led thought process of how to create a nation, and Nyerere was kind of motivated by the Maoist Marxist regime in China, uh, less so with the Soviets. But he thought like Tanzania had a lot in common with China at the time, both multi-ethnic, but with an influential ethnic groups that were dominant. But with regards to creating a state, Nyerere realized that he had to destroy ethnicity, as you said. And one way to do this was to create these villages that he called Ujamaa, and family as the framework of developmental economics, but also political social reordering of society. So on one hand, there was this creation of an economy based on what he called African socialism, which was different from European socialism in the sense that it was focused on kinship. And if these kinships were kind of loosening as a result of colonial enterprise, he wanted to reignite them and make them forceful. So that's one part. The second part of it was um, creating a political system that allowed for competition without multi-party system.
Mm.
So unlike other one-party states at the dawn of independence in Africa, uh, in the case of Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, there was competition within the party. So it was like a very interesting political climate within TANU and later on CCM, where you pretty much had all the hallmarks of democratic competition without multi-party. It was
Mm.
not a guarantee that you would win a seat. And, Nyerere often had prop-up candidates just to create an idea of competition. So TANU was institutionalized uh, with regards to competitive politics, but also TANU was spread around the country in such a way that at the time that it turned into CCM, it had cells pretty much in every part of the country, from Zanzibar, southern Tanzania, northern Tanzania, in every part, in the towns and in the villages, in the cities and all the places, to the point that at some point the party was more present in people's lives than the state.
Mm.
So there's this idea of institutionalization and restructuring of the economy and creating a political economy based on kinship that Nyerere fostered in Tanzania. Now, there are certain good things that come, as you already said earlier, Dr. Akhtar, which is uh, the idea of national unity that was very present in Tanzania and nation building as a project, but building an economy kind of took a backstage a little bit because the ideological positions that Nyerere took um, costed a lot. Because they cost a lot of money, and they had to prioritize nation building and later on build an economy. So if you look at the economic data at the time in the 60s, you realize Tanzania was way ahead of other East African peers. But by 1966, some of the countries like Kenya and Uganda had surpassed it with regards to economic production because Nyerere was busy building a nation. So I just wanted to leave it there because we have a whole hour to talk
Yes.
about it.
Yes.
Yes, yeah,
No, great, great. Thank you
yeah,
so much. And actually, I
yeah,
just wanted to pivot a
yeah.
little bit back to Zanzibar
Mhm.
because I think so much we kind of leave Zanzibar to kind of almost focusing primarily on the mainland. And being that Samia Suluhu Hassan, the current president of Tanzania, is a Zanzibarian by birth, that's her background. I kind of want to speak just for a couple of minutes about the revolution and how that kind of may have shaped political climate that's going on. Because something that I've been hearing a lot of is being that she's coming from a more of a minority background, it kind of has shaped the way that she's almost stacked her cabinet. And I wanted to touch a little bit more on kind of like the revolutionary history of Zanzibar and how it may have affected her. Professor Akhtar.
Yes, okay. Um, so I mean, I think that I mean, okay, so Zanzibar, it in the 19th century, right? It
Yeah.
was the capital of the Omani Empire,
Mhm.
right? So it had, it was an incredibly diverse society. And yeah, I would say that, kind of in a way, you could think of it in the 19th century, something like what maybe Dubai is today. So it was kind of a major point of trade between East Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, right, which is now India and Pakistan in that region. So it was a really important transit point for the Indian Ocean region, and it was extremely wealthy. That's the only reason why, the capital would have been transferred there, right? So, I think it was extremely multicultural. I think the development, it's not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of culture as well. So even, think about the language of Tanzania, Swahili, right? Swahili emerges out of this interaction of, sort of the Bantu sort of languages, right, of sub-Saharan Africa and particularly sort of the East, then uh, connecting with Arab traders, with a Persian, Shirazi, you have influences of Portuguese, right? And the Portuguese coming into East Africa. So it's a really unique sort of cultural and economic place. And what happens with the revolution is that you have two things. One is the collapse of that entire world, essentially, and the majority of Zanzibaris who, you have thousands of Arabs who were killed as a part of the revolution, um, which was kind of a horrific situation. And then beyond that, what ends up happening also is beyond the death is just kind of like the economic sort of end to this incredibly prosperous sort of society. So the revolution essentially it allows a little bit of sort of connection. The idea also, what ends up happening is that the very lucrative clove industry ends up being nationalized, and it is okay for a while. But then what ends up happening is that the collapse of the clove industry also then puts it into sort of an economic spiral. And so Zanzibar also, in Tanzania, just Tanganyika, is also going through a very important decolonization in which there's a competition between the Soviets and the Americans, right, for influence, right? And so Zanzibar then also is sort of enters very quickly into a union with Tanganyika, creating Tanzania. And so I think Zanzibaris have an entire history of civilization of essentially being uh, an independent country, you would say, in a way. And so there is, and culturally, it's also very different, right? So it's also majority Muslim sort of country as well, right? So you have Muslim majority, a very unique sort of cultural heritage that's being then subsumed into a larger Tanzanian identity. And the way that the political construct, of the nation, they really sort of feel that they are not given the type of autonomy that they thought they were promised initially with the union.
Mm.
And so there's quite a number of political grievances that also, have emerged over time. And but that doesn't necessarily, but what ends up happening is that anyone that comes into sort of the ruling class essentially ends up also then adopting those politics, right? So there are, opposition groups in Zanzibar, and there was contested elections years ago as well, and a lot of challenges. But just because the current president is from Zanzibar doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to favor Zanzibar, or in fact, it's possible that she actually has to um, not favor Zanzibar in order to be seen as more politically legitimate, sort of within the larger
Mm.
Tanzanian
Mm.
sort of society, right? And the fact that she's a woman also is a challenge, and that she has to project a greater amount of power, right? So there's a lot of complexity that goes into it. But there's certainly a lot of unfinished sort of business, I would say, with regards to sort of Zanzibari politics. And that's, I think, one part of the larger reason why the current ruling party has cracked down so hard, because they see that there are tremendous amounts of fissures that have emerged over the last couple of decades, not just in terms of ethnopolitics, but also generational politics.
Great.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, and I wanted to bring that up because we have this idea that Tanzania has always had this kind of very peaceful history politically, and I think Zanzibar lends that not the myth of it, but there's on a micro level, it's not that seamless. So kind of moving on to the current turmoil that we're seeing, and I'll start with you, Professor Codero. Obviously, recent elections, we've seen a lot of protests. We've seen the extrajudicial actions in terms of the ruling party. We've seen the jailing of Tundu Lissu, the main opposition leader of the Chadema party. And we've seen reported mass attacks and killings of protesters, currently reported up to almost 1,000, which has not been verified. by international, but nationally, we are hearing from a lot of our fellow Tanzanians that this is happening. So I just wanted to get your take and give us a kind of a roll through of what's been going on and what you have been hearing and your understanding of the current turmoil, and why these accusations of repression and economic democratic backsliding should be taken very seriously.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philip, for the question. I think it's really sad what is happening in Tanzania right now. As Dr. Akhtar has already said, Zanzibar has experienced sort of this episodes of political violence because the elections there tend to be really close and narrow. And I think at the moment they have the last government was a coalition government to sort of like mitigate the political tension that arose out of the 2020 election. Um, but in Tanzania, generally, there is sort of like a short answer, and then the proximate factors that lead to the event that we're witnessing now. Now, the short answer, as you already stated, is the feeling of lack of democratic exercise on the people. The people feel were never given a choice to elect a candidate of their wanting, and it's not totally a conversation against the person of President Suluhu. It's
Mm,
mostly like a sort of, if you use like a street slang, like a beef with the CCM parties taking um, uh, the people for granted. It's like,
mm,
oh, we're gonna do whatever we want. It don't matter. And it would have been different. There would be disgruntlement if CCM would have won with Tunde Lissu on the ballot and other opposition candidate. They still have won. I think they would have won with like almost 60% because Tanzania is pretty much still a very um, the concentration of population is in the rural areas and
mm,
the urban centers, the five major cities where the opposition tends to win election and not enough to win the entirety. So even with that, you see a situation where CCM will win maybe 60%, maybe quite a number of uh, parliamentary seats. Maybe not all. Right now they have 98. I mean,
mm,
they have 100 actually. And they have 98% on the presidential ballot. Is ridiculous. So
mhm,
that's really the short course of the problem. But the long end of it is sort of like the absence of President Nyerere's leadership, as he retired and died, it was replaced with people who are not ideologues and not revolutionaries and not really nationalists as Nyerere was. Okay, so the CCM, which I was talking about, transformed into CCM after the merger with the Afro Shirazi Party, I think. Now, is that correct? I believe
yeah,
it's Afro Shirazi Party. Yeah.
yes, yeah.
So the political leaders who took over the party from Nyerere were not committed to the same things that Nyerere was committed to. They were mostly committed to power preservation. And in the 90s, CCM changes from like a Maoist Marxist party to more like a neoliberal um, catch-all political party with no clear ideological position. All
Mm,
right, and the focus was then winning election. Now they won pretty competitively, and Hassan Mwinyi wasn't really opposed so much because Nyerere was present. Mkapa was opposed a little bit in the party, but when the election came, he won. He had a commanding lead at the national election, although there were opposition parties like CAF and NCCR Mageuzi. Then you come to Kikwete, who had opposition within the nomination process at the party, but he won like an 88% uh, majority votes at the election time. Now, it's the beginning of the Kikwete regime that really transforms the politics of CCM and Tanzania overall, because opposition candidates, while allowed to compete and talk, there was sort of like a culture, a repressive culture of dissent, okay? And usually there was like a purge on perception of corruption, but often that came after speaking against the party. So there was massive corruption happening. and Kikwete tried to clean it up. At some point, firing the entirety of his cabinet, almost a quarter or maybe a half. I can't remember now. But there was also feeling that those who were politically opposed to him were the one who got the axe for being corrupt. So it wasn't really fun. Then we get to Magufuli in 2015. And the Magufuli era was interesting because it was an unexpected choice. Went through the competitive process within the 80 CCM party and won over some luminaries like the Masai guy called Lowassa, who was expected to be the president after Kikwete. Um, but Lowassa then exits CCM and forms an opposition coalition. And this coalition gives CCM a run for their money.
Mm,
Magufuli wins by about 55%. And it's
yeah.
like everybody was hopeful that, wow, opposition politics is now maturing in Tanzania. But then Magufuli really crafted a political system in which economic nationalism was the center of his focus, but political opposition was kind of like an enemy of the state. Like you said earlier, uh, the vocality of politics now centered on economic nationalism rather than political dissent. So this crisis of Tanzania that we see in this era starts mostly by Magufuli, but had been going on for a while after the exit of President Nyerere.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you so much. Thank you so much. Professor Akhtar, just kind of bringing like a global comparative. I mean, we're seeing, I think you mentioned similar things going on in a lot of Asian countries as well. I mean, we just saw in Sri Lanka, I think the prime minister has been now been asked, basically accused of attacking and murdering the student protests that occurred there. But she's being requested to be extradited, I think, out of India. And then we saw what's going on as well in Nepal. So I guess what, especially this kind of youth-led movement, could you speak kind of to that in terms of like the comparative, not just East Africa, but just on a global scale, what's going on, especially on the youth side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the larger framework that I think even Mozambique and other places is the Gen Z protests, right? So it's
Yeah.
the idea that you have essentially like an old guard that is in charge of sort of power, so the politics of many parts of the world, and like that is simply not meeting the needs of young people. So I think one is like the economic and needs. So people are not able to find good jobs, not able to, buy houses. Inflation's very high. So what are sort of the economic realities of people feeling like they're not able to have a better life? I think that's part of it. The second is like a lack of representation. So just the biggest thing I think in most developing countries in Africa and Asia is corruption. That's the biggest problem, right? So it's a lack of economic development, and then whatever funds that exist are siphoned off by sort of party elites. And we saw this in Nepal and other places. So this kind of lack of accountability, and so people um, grew up in an age in which they're taught about democracy in schools, or the idea that people have accountability, but then the reality, their lived reality is quite the opposite, right? So I think that you're seeing sort of that frustration play out. But then you also have so you have that as one part of it, but then you also have the larger in the developed world, um, the global north. Shifts towards autocracy and
Mm,
authoritarianism and the rightward turn of politicians, right? So you kind of have a more democratic grassroots movement and desire for change, and you have a top-down sort of desire to control society from the top. And I think that's leading to many of the ideological clashes and polarization that's taking place in societies. Is you kind of have an older guard that wants to keep control of society. You have a younger generation that wants change, and you also have a um, evolving information reality as well between social media, AI, that's also changing, that allows you to be able to communicate in diverse ways across diverse media, um, sometimes positively in terms of opposition perspectives, and sometimes negatively in terms of misinformation as well, right? So I think that that's also challenging the way that traditional authoritarian politics sort of work. Um, and so that's also, and there's just a lot of fear, I think, of um, a changing global order by people that are in power. So you see kind of a breakdown in neoliberalism. You have kind of a breaking apart of traditional global economics as well between the Sinosphere and the Anglosphere, which is also then upending traditional sort of trade networks and patronage networks that have historically sort of emerged. So I think that there's just a lot of economic and social factors I think that are playing into what happened, and so leaders, unfortunately, in Tanzania, have taken the idea that the best way to deal with this is simply to try to consolidate power and to stifle all opposition. And I think that might work for a period of time, but the the Tanzania of Nyerere is very different from the Tanzania of today. People are more educated, more connected to the outside world. There's a greater degree of urbanization and a need for economic reform and economic sort of opportunity. And then you also have the influence also of the Tanzanian diaspora, right, in terms of ideas and money. And so it's a much more complex sort of ecosystem. So I think that while they were able to consolidate power through this election, I think in the long term, they are going to have to open up the political system. Otherwise, you just simply need to you maintain more to maintain that sort of power. You have to put more and more time and effort and into kind of controlling society. And I don't know how successful that will be in the long term.
Oh, absolutely amazing. Professor Codero, I like Professor Akhtar touched on something I know Dr. Cox would be proud in terms of political economy. Um,
Yes.
focusing a lot more on the Kenyan perspective. I know a lot of Kenyans were looking over the border and were kind of holding their breath with the expectation of how what had happened in Kenya, especially with the advent of the Gen Z and then social media playing a major role, how that would affect what was going on in Tanzania. From the Kenyan perspective, what are the Kenyans saying, especially young people, when they're looking across the border at what happened? And especially the usage of social media as well.
I was listening to, I was following this keenly as a Kenyan myself. I have relatives who are from across the border, but I'm a Kenyan, and so it was I was following a lot of keenness on what on the development in Tanzania. A lot of young people in Kenya are supportive of the protest and worried about the situation with regards to potential loss of life. About 1,000 people estimated, reported, and not being clarified as you said earlier. So there was a lot of support for the young protesters, not for their death. Because there was a thinking that it's a moment of awareness and potential for possible new ways of doing politics that had not been seen in Tanzania before. But even beyond Kenya, there's just like a feeling of anxiety and economic angst among young people. But also there's like unmet expectation of what Pan-Africanism and or in the region which we call Jumuiyan. So a lot of Jumuiyans, we mean members of the federations, are very sick of the political class and how they use political patronage and disrespect the citizens. And this, a region where the average age is about 19. So
Mm,
there's a lot of anger, but it's the positive side is could be maybe this will be one of those opportunities for new ways of doing politics. And as the professor said, I don't think that increasing repressive tactics and consolidating power in this atmosphere is going to end very well for the leadership in Tanzania right now.
mm. Thank you for the answer. It's
Yeah.
interesting because Tanzania has seen such economic growth over the last couple of years, and I think Kenya has seen the same thing as well. And usually, you have there's an expectation with economic growth that this would actually create more stability. But like you stated, this kind of uh, feeling that they've been excluded from this growth is really challenging. Um, in speaking to members of my family in Tanzania, there was this idea that many Tanzanians would kind of just just let things go because we're all about poor, poor, very relaxed in terms of even keeled in comparison to our Kenyan cousins who have had a kind of a history of a lot of political activism. What do you think was the trigger, the catalyst that made things different this time than in past? Even with Magufuli, there was a lot of kind of angst, and I think even you spoke about with Kikwete, there was some issues as well. But what was it that was the difference maker with this particular election? And either of you, I think I start with Professor Codero and then move to Professor Akhtar.
It was the ridiculousness of it all. Like,
Oh,
how
not
do you
ridiculous. The challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about a diplomatic term,
yeah,
but I
yeah,
think I have feelings too, and they come out other times. But
yeah,
I think that yeah, I mean, it could be done better. I mean, we have a lot of authoritarian systems in the global south and a lot of election fraud. This one was just not, you don't expect it in a place that's with a lot of people with Wangwana like
yeah,
Tanzanians,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
I mean,
Professor
I
Akhtar?
think one of
Mhm.
the challenges also is just how um see like the okay, if you're gonna do uh one of the problems, right? Like one of the problems with authoritarianism, right? Okay, so one of the larger parts, one of the challenges of government generally is you need to have live data about the society that you're governing in order to make good policy decisions, right? And
Mhm.
so, generally, in a democracy, that's why you have sort of the free press, and that allows you to be able to get live information from diverse perspectives, and then you assimilate that information, and then you create policies. The problem in authoritarian societies is that you don't have that, right? So you have to cultivate some sort of way of being able to get the pulse of a society without giving total freedom and free speech. And so, um, like countries like China, for instance, they do this in a couple ways. One is that they allow a certain amount of freedom of speech and certain things are off limits. That's one way of doing it. Another way is intelligence agencies. So you have people that are on the ground that are collecting information and they give it to the state in order to figure out what's going on. Um, and so I think what's happened essentially for Tanzania is because of um, the the rule of CCM for so long, it has really gone out of touch with what's going on the ground with people and particularly with young people as well. And so, you have this urban rural divide, which is a big challenge. And then just generally being able to make, you just basically don't have leadership that has a clear vision for the society as a whole, right? So there's no like, you know, um, Saudi Arabia has a, 2050 plan, right? In terms of like where the country's headed economically, where the resources going, sort of a long-term planning. So it's kind of stuck between wanting to be a capitalist society, because I have quite a number of, people that I know and family members and others that, because, historically the Zanzibari community and sort of Indian communities tended to be very much involved in trade, right? And so that's kind of the historic. So one of the things about Tanzania that's really problematic is that it shifts between socialism and capitalism over and over again, right? So you have these bouts where free trade and free market is possible, and then the state, withdraws that and says, okay, now you have to give us money. They come up with new taxes, new regulations and things like that. And so that's part of also the reason why when you compare it to Kenya, Kenya has a much larger economy. It's much wealthier, generally speaking, even though there's big disparities in terms of wealth. Whereas Tanzania historically would have been poorer, but a little bit more of, equally poor essentially. And what you have essentially is a situation where there's there's a lack of real free market sort of policies, but then you also have So you have that, but you also have widening inequality in society, right? So you don't have enough of economic growth to be able to deal with the social inequalities of society, right? So you have problems in a society when their economic growth is limited, right? So if there's enough money to go around, people are generally okay, even if there's sort of inequality. The problem with Tanzania is that you have really bad policies with regards to economic growth. So there's not enough money, and you have growing inequality, and you have people who are educated that can't find jobs. So there's a tremendous amount of frustration, and that information, those ideas are not being communicated to the top, and you don't have leadership that's able to sort of really navigate society. So I think, a good example as a counterbalance to this would be, and I hate to say this as like good authoritarianism, but Rwanda is a good example, right? They went through a horrible genocide. The society is authoritarian, but it's also their economic policies have minimized corruption and allowed there to be economic growth. Other, Western societies invest in that. They're able to use their mineral wealth in order to grow the economy of the society. So I think, it's kind of Tanzania stuck in a way. It's stuck between the old guard and new guard. It's stuck between socialism and capitalism. It's stuck between, a Tanzania of Nyerere's vision and something that has yet to come out in terms of Tanzania as sort of as a global international sort of player, right? And so that's kind of how I see part of the challenge of what's going on, you know?
Great,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Professor, I know this is your specialty as well. If you could kind of give some commentary in terms of the economic aspect of this situation.
Yeah, there was a sort of like countries that went through reform. I agree with what the professor said. It's really right on the spot. Um, it's like a study on neoliberal changes in the 80s and how countries fared after that. And in the short time, when you get the reform, because you're starting from a really low base, you get a lot of economic output. Like we saw that in Uganda in the 90s.
Mm.
All right. And if this neoliberal change is combined with sort of institutional establishment that then those institutions mature, and then there's a possibility, there's hope amongst the people, especially in these spaces where a lot of people are young,
Mm.
then you're going to have political stability. And that reform can then lead to democratization or have hybrid systems, okay? You're going to have a lot more stable society over time. And you probably might graduate into a liberal democracy over time. If you do have those neoliberal reform and you're not reforming the institutions, then what you're going to get is chronic capitalism. And that's worse than any form of authoritarian or mixed economic system you can have. Because chronic capitalism leads to elite capture and elite replication over and over. And if you have a population that's huge, like in Tanzania, like 70 million now, you have having about 60 million people living living in deplorable condition. You're gonna have about 10 million who own everything. I mean, we have some of the biggest billionaires coming out of Tanzania. But when you go to the countryside, you won't see that. And it's really a terrible system. So there was an attempt, especially during the Mwinyi era, to neoliberalize. And as you said, Magufuli just wiped out all these gains, okay? And I don't know, Suluhu hasn't just figured out what to do in the first regime. There was some sort of like economic growth as a result of natural resource export, especially gas, but there's not a lot of reform in the economy, in the real economy of many Tanzanians. So what you see here is a bulging youth population that is fairly more educated than under Nyerere time, that have no opportunity, and they're angry. They're going to be angry every 5 years. And if it's not controlled, it's going to get worse, right? Something has to give. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Uh,
Yeah.
and in that note as well, despite attempts by the government with the internet blackouts, youth activists continue to organize. To both of you, how has technology shaped political participation especially as Professor Akhtar has said, the attempt to control information has been huge. But obviously, we're seeing social media, Twitter, especially being utilized both throughout Kenya and Tanzania. So, how has it really shaped political participation in East Africa overall? And how does this amplify generational tensions with the older political elite? Start with Professor Codero.
Well, social media is influential, and there's kind of like two ways. If you look at on internet, Tanzania has like a soft culture,
Yeah,
and its soft culture is more pronounced than some of the countries in the region. I'm talking Kenya or Uganda, right?
yeah.
Partly because of bongo flavor, and that's kind of as it has queued over to other spaces as well, in social media spaces like TikTok as dances.
Mm-hmm.
And as this tension was arising, the already present soft cultural influence of Tanzania was transformed into opportunities for dissent. And this is where this protest came out of. They came out of the government forgot that while they're very proud of this culture creation, they didn't realize that it could be politicized. And when it was politicized, it came back as a boomerang, hurting some of the leading creators or entertainers who unfortunately sided with the political class. Now, the government response was saying, let's ban everything. In the banning of social media, it's sort of like a classic textbook case of an authoritarian regime. Uh, it doesn't really help because it simmers the situation, but it's able to save the regime, and they are able to do whatever they did, like swear in a president and conduct some kind of mock ceremonies. But the tension is kind of simmering. It's like a boiling cup of tea that's closed up. And when the lid was up, a lot of young people started posting these videos, and it was shocking to see. It was shocking, right? And the government's response was, well, it's punishable under Tanzanian law to dehumanize people by posting their images of the injured and the dead. So they, in a way, trying to sanction social media again. But I think the cat is already out of the bag. Everybody in the world knows what happened there.
Mm-hmm.
So social media was very influential. And my point is, the CCM regime, as repressive as it was, allowed creators and artists to kind of populate the internet and have fans that posted their thing, and that's really what turned out to be opportunities for dissent.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
Professor Akhtar?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the other sort of major challenges also is, one of the things that we saw with the elections was also that the internet was turned off for a while, right? So they had like turned off the internet. You were not able to call on WhatsApp. The desire to control sort of the information, I think, is a big part of it, right? So, and that's a very clumsy way of dealing with like political sort of challenges, right? So clearly, the people that are in power didn't have either the technical know-how or understanding of kind of the social media sort of world, right, to be able to, um, launch a better, for instance, even the election campaign, right, through social media. I mean, there's so many ways that it could have been done. This election could have been done differently. And I do prove, I believe Professor Codero is right, right? Like, I think still the ruling party would have won. With less. So there's a more of an existential. I mean, I feel like it speaks to like why now? Why are they doing it now? Right? I mean, it's very weird. You had kind of the Zanzibar election a couple years ago, and that was also
also
contested.
contested.
But eventually, what they ended up doing is they ended up negotiating with Zanzibari political elites, right? And kind of they were able to kind of mollify them. So the question is like, what exactly happened this time that they felt that they had to win by 98, like, 98% of the vote? Like, what exactly happened? My
Yeah,
opinion, it's kind of very odd, right? So what's going on? I mean, my feeling is that there's also a larger. It speaks not to like what is the situation in Tanzania, but I think larger fractures that are developing, within the ruling party itself. That sort of that that they felt the need to consolidate that way. But also, I think the socioeconomic, um, the lack of sort of socioeconomic growth, right? So I think there's a combination of things. Like internally, um, the the party doesn't feel that it has complete control of the society, and then sort of informationally, it definitely doesn't know how to deal with all of sort of the challenges of the younger generation. And then economically, it's just not growing sufficiently to meet the needs of the population. And so I feel like these socio-political and economic sort of changes have taken place. And I think honestly, CCM, from my perspective, it's just, like any sort of political party, if you're in power too long, you really forget how to govern effectively, right? So it's just kind of like you resort to, like you were saying, Professor Codero, crony capitalism, rent seeking, all of these things that just really suck the society of sort of vitality and sort of economic growth, basically.
Hmm.
Excellent. Excellent. No, great analysis on that one. Um, I'd seen that a lot of these challenges, as we're continuing to see, like they're the way that the young people are dealing with it, it's creating a new way of kind of projecting this different image. And I wonder if the political elite were fearful of the image of Tanzania as this island of bastion of peace where being challenged. And so I've wondered, like, maybe that was the reasoning behind the crazy 98% electoral turnout, positioning. And to speak to that, what's your perspective, like, globally, how is this going to affect Tanzania in terms of the way the major two hegemons look at Tanzania when speaking with China and the United States, looking at the current electoral climate and the current turmoil? Is this going to have some sort of like long-term effect in terms of like trade, in terms of military imbalance challenges, being that Tanzania is an ally to both nations, both China and the United States? I would go Professor Codero first.
Okay. Thank you for the question. It's a wonderful question. I actually thought about it a little bit,
Yeah,
and I've been thinking about it as this protests have been going on. It's like, what is the we're kind of like the big kid in the room who's gonna order everybody to do stuff the right way. And the answer is there's no one right now.
yeah,
I mean, in the past, the United States have played that role. But there's with the MAGA first movement, there's really little appetite for foreign entanglement, if it's not transactional.
mm,
So even if it was transactional, if it was like the Congo, for example, you would still see engagement that necessarily doesn't lead to peace or institutional growth, but mostly how can we access the market and get the stuff we need from them. So with regard to Tanzania, I don't think the United States is gonna. There might be some diplomatic cables about human rights in a performative sense, but it's not gonna be like Barack Obama's administration where you like you do a press conference and talk about this or send a video to Tanzanians.
mm,
That's not gonna happen. Um, or Bush administration sending Condoleezza Rice to Arusha to talk to the Kenyans.
mm,
That's not gonna happen now. With China, China think of Tanzania very highly, was one of the earliest allies in the region. In the 80s, they built the Tazara Railway, and they built quite a lot of things there. It's got a lock and key with CCM, the Chinese Communist Party. It's got a lock and key with them. I don't expect them to say anything. They'll continue with business as usual. Oh, you hope the European partners,
yeah,
especially the Nordic countries, um, they have been a little more responsive. Uh, they have issued statements that are questioning the authenticity and validity of the election. But as traditional partners of Tanzania at the global scene, they're not hegemony. They're just like small actors.
correct.
So yeah. So this is kind of how I think about it.
Okay. Professor Akhtar?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, like, what, unfortunately, because of how underdeveloped Tanzania is, like economically, it is just seen by the two major powers as a place for resource extraction, right? So it's kind of like, what can you get in terms of gold, in terms of other sort of maybe critical minerals and things like that. So definitely the Chinese are not interested in, they will work with whoever is there. And I think the American administration right now is totally interested in simply sort of economic deals, right? They have very
Right.
little interest in democracy promotion. And I think that entire I mean, my perspective is that in the long run, the entire human rights regime is really going to suffer in the next couple of decades, because I feel like the decline of the West, and then the rise of kind of not just China, but just generally kind of more multilateralism, is really going to mean that the norms of, you would have to have some other discourse to emerge, um, uh, that would some sort of other normative regime, essentially, that would kind of allow states to be able to change their behaviors. Because right now, just saying human rights or saying democracy means nothing, I think, in many parts of the world at this point. And I think the West is so consumed with its own internal politics and its polarization, it has very little interest in engaging with other parts of the world. So, yeah. I
Right.
mean, I think, yeah, as long as it doesn't hinder Tanzania's ability to export, um, it's fine, Like no one is really gonna bat an eye, really, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay. Well, some last question that we have here, and thank you both so much for this. If you can identify one factor that will most shape Tanzania's political future, whether it's its youth, its institutions, political culture, or regional influences, what would it be in your perspective? And I'll start, Professor Akhtar.
Again,
Say again?
uh, can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, if you could identify one factor that is going to most shape Tanzania's political future, whether it's going to be its youth, its institutions, or regional influence, such as the bongo flavor aspect, what do you think will be?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is that's going to drive everything is going to be the economics. I think if they're able to find some sort of, um, I mean, the problem with it is that, resource extraction simply does not provide enough economic development
Mm,
for the large population that is Tanzania. Really, what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to move up the value chain and being able to produce, things outside of sort of those resources, right? Like you're able to build capital the higher up you go in terms of the building of sort of any sort of machinery, right? So, I mean, that's kind of what we saw with countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, other countries, right? That they were able to kind of move up the value chain, Vietnam, these other countries. And so part of that, I think, is also Tanzania finding some sort of niche within the emerging global economic system that it can sort of harness. And the second also is being able to you know, really train up its young people.
mm,
So it needs to develop its human capital, and that's another thing. So even if you don't have resources, you have human capital. Japan is a good example. It has very poor natural resources, but it has extremely capable human capital. And unfortunately, I think for Tanzania, that also means learning English. I think that's going to be a big part of it, because it doesn't necessarily have the internal scientific capacity. So it really needs to learn that and adapt that, right? So that's kind of how one of the ways that China was able to do it. It sent people abroad, the people came back, they brought scientific information and knowledge, and it was able to draw and sort of develop sort of its economy. Tanzania is so underdeveloped compared to Kenya. I mean, I remember even whenever I go back or I do research, a lot of times the people, for instance, even in a basic industry like tourism, for instance, a lot of them are Kenyans, right? Because they speak English better, they have like much more training with sort of tourism and sort of that sort of economy, right? So you really need to be able to develop the human capital to be able to and figure out some sort of niche in sort of global supply chains to be able to make the type of economic development that's necessary. Because otherwise, resource extraction, it's just it's going to be kind of like an oil curse sort of situation, like Nigeria, or a small elite that is able to make a ton of money, and the majority of the society kind of suffers in the background.
Great, great. Professor Codero?
Yeah, I think you said it all. I was just thinking about civil society organization. It's sort of like instruments of it's more focused on the economy of it. I'm
Mm,
thinking about the politics of it. It'll be mostly like a more robust civil society organization. And I think one way out of this situation will be like a sort of like a national dialogue about how to move forward. And you could probably do what they did with the Zanzibar for in the short term, but in the long run opening up political spaces as well as opening up the economic system for competitive uh, engagement with multiple players.
good, good. Okay. Well, thank you
Yeah,
both so much for being here and having this amazing dialogue. I really appreciate it, and I know our university appreciates it. So thank you so much, and I hope you both have an amazing rest of your week.
thank you
Thanks
very
a lot,
much.
Philip. I appreciate it. And nice to meet you, Professor Codero.
Nice to meet you
Okay.
too, Dr.
All right, nashukuru sana.
Asante.
Haya,
Asante
Have
sana.
a good one. Bye.